Hey divas, I have gone back and forth on how to make video content successfully. I feel like the initial drafts I were recording were just so scripted and I just felt like I was in like a Miss America pageant. And I feel like I just want my video content to feel more authentic to me and feel more like we are yapping on FaceTime. So I don't really know what this vlogging era will look like, nor do I really feel like it's going to be that successful. But, we'll give it a go. I think 2026 is a year that I'm in many ways starting over. So why not start a new chapter of sort of vlogging? I think I'm going to do sort of monthly reading wrap ups and reading vlogs that sort of have a theme to them and other sort of video content that strikes my fancy. I think, over the last month or so, I've been using my Substack more. I've been posting different types of content, and I feel like I just like content creation as sort of a creative outlet. And not that there's anything wrong with Instagram, but I feel like after using it for 3 years, I feel like I'm just sort of craving new ways to talk about books because I cannot shut up about books literally ever. And yeah, I think obviously, as we saw in December, Instagram can sort of arbitrarily delete your account at any given point, and thankfully I got my account back. But I don't like having all of my eggs in one basket because when you create community on a single platform and then lose that community overnight, not so great. So for my first video, I kind of just wanted to do sort of an informal catch up. I want to talk about 5 books that I think, for better or for worse, sort of defined my 2025 reading year. I want to talk a little bit about my recent breakup because that obviously has been front of mind in a lot of my content and a lot of my posts recently. And then I also just want to talk a little bit about 2026 and sort of what I have planned. So let's just dive in. Okay, so I don't own a lot of these books still, so I'm gonna have to edit like a little cute little thumbnail of the book covers. The first book, of course, I want to talk about is called The Mind Reels by Frederick de Boer. And if you recall, this was probably my most controversial review to date. I haven't really talked about it since August when shit hit the fan, let's say. But essentially, the book was sent to me as an ARC. For full transparency, I requested it from Coffee House Press. I was interested in the subject matter. So it's a campus novel about grappling with mental health, depression, anxiety, and it was a debut release from this author. So I was interested to sort of see sort of a fresh take on sort of a trope that's been, I think, explored quite a bit. And within the first 20 pages, I just sort of immediately got the ick from this book because it was so like man writing a woman. And there was just so many instances of sort of misogyny or overtly sexual descriptions that just felt gratuitous and completely unnecessary. And I pointed that out in my review. I marked it as a did not finish on Goodreads. I think I ended up getting like 75 pages in, and I want to say it's maybe a 200-page book. So I felt like I gave it a fair shake. Then the author posted my review on to Reddit, and I got harassed and I got a lot of hate mail. The author also commented on my review on Goodreads, and truly it was, I think, one of the more interesting cases of dealing with an author. Normally, I have thick skin. I don't really care. My reviews are for readers, they're not for authors, but it's rare that I think I fully engage with an author in that way. And I posted it full. All this stuff is still saved as a highlight on my Instagram page, but navigating that was truly so bizarre because, like, there was a lot of people messaging me who had never even read the book defending this man, and I'm like, what do you have to offer in this situation? And two, again, I was posting this review for readers, not necessarily for the author, and so it just left me with a bad taste in my mouth because, like, why is an author responding not only on Goodreads but then also on Reddit denying these allegations? Looking through his Reddit, it was also very obvious that he had a plethora of misogynistic content. So I felt a little bit better knowing that, like, my perception of this book was probably rooted in some degree of reality, whether that was a unconscious or conscious bias or not. So I ended up reaching out to the publisher just to say, hey, here's what's happening. And they unfollowed me, and I haven't heard anything from them since. So I am personally boycotting Coffee House Press titles. I'm not encouraging anyone else to do so. That's just my own experience. But it sort of just left me with a bad taste in my mouth because I think that readers should get a little bit of credit. Not that it's super noble to read an arc or anything like that, but it does take time. It does take attention. It does take, oftentimes unpaid labor to create these reviews for arcs. And it's free marketing for the publisher. And not to say that, it requires you to lie in your review or sort of sugarcoat the truth. But I feel like there should be safe space for people to be sort of honest. And perhaps my review was too critical, but I just don't think that it was really the best reaction from the author. And even if the publisher gave me sort of a platitude and said, like, we're sorry this happened, we're going to look into it, that would have been appreciated. But um, yeah, so essentially, I will not be reviewing their titles. I may still read some of their titles because they do publish a fair bit of translated literature that I really appreciate. But I think just for my own mental health, I am not going to be promoting them on my page any further. The next book I want to talk about is, I think, my most liked review on Goodreads, which again is ironic because it's one of my more negative reviews, and that is We Love You, Bunny by Mona Awad. If you know anything about me, I loved the original Bunny. I read it with friends for a book club. Me and my best friend talk about it constantly. We both ate it up. I think it strikes that perfect balance of having meaningful commentary, but also being sort of shockingly weird and ambiguous. And I feel like it just holds up really well on rereads, for discussions, for critique, for analysis. And I think Bunny is sort of, I get why people don't like it. I know it's a pretty divisive book, but I personally saw the genius in it, and it sort of, hit the right wavelengths in my brain. I was a little bit apprehensive seeing that Mona Awad was launching a sequel to it. It did feel a little bit sort of fan servicey, and I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with fan service. I think I obviously was down to read it either way. I was interested to sort of see how she took, a story that didn't necessarily, I feel like, lead into a sequel that well, and sort of see what she did with it. And I was curious too because it was marketed as a book that you didn't necessarily need to read Bunny to read this book, because it was both a prequel and a sequel. So I was lucky enough to get an ARC, and super appreciative again to the publisher for sending me an ARC. I unfortunately just hated this book. It was my least favorite book of 2025. I think it just was redundant, honestly. I think it took all the magic from the original book and sort of pulled the curtain back a little too much and said, here's what I meant with every symbol, with every metaphor, with every sort of piece of dialogue, and sort of hits you over the head with the explanation. And I don't know many readers that read Bunny that liked it and said, like, wow, I really wish Mona Awad had given us, more concrete information to work with. I know people who disliked it and said it was just too sort of weird and over their head, and that's totally fine. So it just felt like a bit of a mismatch. Like, who is the target audience? Because the people who liked the book perhaps didn't really need this sequel. And now we have news that we're getting a third book, and I'm just struggling to understand where the hell we're going with this series. I honestly don't know if I'll read the third book. I think the second book being 500 pages, being so long, being so repetitive, essentially being a retelling of the original with some slight variations, it just did not work for me. And I don't love the fact that it's one of my favorite authors, and like, my most liked review now is a negative review of their book. But again, it's one of those things where I think normalizing negative reviews and being honest is just sort of part of my ethos as a reviewer. And I get that that's not for everyone. Some people don't like to publicize their negative reviews, but in this case, I just felt like perhaps save your money, or perhaps know that once you read this book, you sort of can't go back. And once the curtain is pulled back, you sort of know everything that Mona Awad intended Bunny to represent. And I think that works sort of for better or for worse. But unfortunately for me as a reader, it was my least favorite read of last year. Third book I want to talk about is Intimacies by Katie Kitamura. And I'm sort of just going to talk about all three of her sort of recent works in tandem, because I think they're all in conversation with each other. So last year she released Audition, which I think was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. And I did quite like Audition. So it's a story of an actress who meets a man who claims to be her son. And she essentially gives us her sort of internal dialogue and reflections, knowing that this is a complete fabrication of the truth. And then I won't spoil the second half, but the second half sort of has a clear divergence from the first, and you sort of explore a very different lens into this situation. And the book is really experimental and worked quite well. And I think I really appreciated it as a follow-up to Intimacies and a Separation, where in each of these three books, you follow a woman who, as part of her career, sort of plays a lot with language and performance. So you follow a translator in A Separation, an interpreter in Intimacies, and then an actress in Audition. And it's a sort of set of three books that I feel like when I think about them, I sort of think about them in tandem with one another because they're so similar. And I think they work really well if you read them sort of in quick succession. So I ended up reading all three of these books within a couple months of each other. And I think it was interesting because I don't think I had ever really given much thought to Katie Kitamura. I always thought it was, for better or for worse, a little bit too highbrow for my taste in literature. But I really appreciated her. I think she's one of my favorite authors now because it's books that leave you thinking. It gives you enough sort of breathing room as a reader to sort of dissect what she means. I ended up reading Audition twice because it's one of those books where it's like, did I miss something? Like, what is it trying to say in certain scenes? And I think even after reading them, there's always that degree of confusion that I think is a sort of a good amount of confusion. And I watch a lot of her author talks and interviews where she sort of pushes back and says, she doesn't want to give readers all the details, or sometimes admits she isn't quite sure why she chose certain deliberate choices in her work. And I think it's just so interesting to sort of get insight into her creative process. And I don't know why. I think her books just have sort of a staying power with me that a lot of books don't. And I'm very curious to see what she writes next because um, these books sort of exist as a triptych. And I don't know if she'll sort of expand upon that or sort of take her work in a new direction. I know she has two books that were published, I think, quite a long time ago, maybe a decade, that I don't see talked about very often. And are pretty hard to sort of hunt down. I can't find them at my library or anything. But I'm curious to go back and sort of see how her writing style has evolved. So she's an author I think I want to explore more. And I think when I think about 2025, she just gave me a lot of things to think about and sort of exposed me to sort of a new set of books that I don't think I would have given the credit that they deserved, if not sort of being pushed by sort of all the attention that the Booker Prize gave her newest release. The next book I'm going to sort of pick on, and it's a fault of me and not the book, and that book is Heart the Lover by Lily King. This is an instance where I saw a lot of buzz about the book. The premise did not capture me, and there was nothing inherently wrong with the premise. It was just one of those books that I looked at and I thought, this doesn't seem like a book I would like. And then I sort of got FOMO because everyone was giving this book 5 stars. Everyone's raving about this book, saying the ending is so devastating. And I ended up reading it, and there's nothing mechanically wrong with the prose. There was nothing wrong with the story, but it just didn't really land for me. I gave it a 3.5 stars. And again, I don't think objectively it's a 3.5 star book. I think objectively it's a perfectly well written book. I just realized I think my subjectivity is sort of taking precedent over that because it's really hard to sort of push your biases and your own personal opinions aside and say, yeah, I think this book deserves better, even though I personally didn't like it. So I think it was just sort of a kick in the pants for me to not fall victim to FOMO and trying to keep up with all the newest releases just because they're popular. And I feel like I've done a pretty good job of that. But over the last couple months, I feel like for better or for worse, I've just been falling into the trap of I sort of hit a reading slump or I'm not finding books that really resonate with me. And then I sort of look at my newsfeed and it's all, the same couple books that are being promoted. And again, I just feel like I need to stray away from that in 2026 and focus on books that really work for me. And yeah, again, like that doesn't mean necessarily that I'm going to love all the books I read because there's plenty of books, especially recently, I've read where the premise really captures my attention. But then once I actually read it, I'm like, wow, I really didn't like that. But at least I'm giving myself the sort of leeway to explore those books. And I'm not falling victim to reading books I'm sort of bound to dislike just because I feel like I am obligated to post a review about them or obligated to sort of join the conversation about them. So plenty of people have read Heart the Lover. I know it's very popular. I'm not saying you should not read it. I'm just saying for me personally, I knew I wasn't going to love it. I read it. I didn't love it. And that should have been my sign to maybe stay in my own lane. The last book I want to talk about is You Will Not Kill Our Imagination. And this was a memoir I got sent, I believe, unsolicited. Perhaps I requested it, but I don't remember. And I sort of picked it up on a whim. And I read a lot of memoirs. I don't read a ton of nonfiction, but when I do, it's almost exclusively memoirs. And I personally think that you can write a memoir about basically anything as long as you write it in a way that's compelling and cohesive, and you really need sort of a central theme or idea to pin things down. I have read memoirs about people whose lives look nothing like mine, who explore concepts or themes that don't resonate with me personally. But if it's well articulated and well written, I think that really goes a long way. This was one of those instances where I think it was beautifully written. I think the subject matter talking about the genocide in Palestine and what it's like to sort of consume news and sort of feel helpless and detached from current events was just articulated so well and really resonated with me. And I know there's been a lot of books. Perfect Victims is a book that comes to mind as well that talk about sort of similar themes to this. But for whatever reason, I think this book just resonated with me in a way that a lot of other Palestinian work um, hasn't quite yet. And that's not a critique necessarily of the authors or the writing. I think it just required a book that really speaks to sort of the complex emotions of grief and helplessness and sort of detachment that we often feel when consuming news that's so hard to process. And I cannot recommend this book enough. It's by a Canadian author, and I feel like Canadian literature often doesn't get platformed as heavily on my newsfeed just because, a lot of the influencers I follow or people I follow are based in America where, obviously there's a lot more publishers and reach there. But I would highly recommend this book, whether you consume it via audio, whether you get it from your library. I think it is the single book that I would say that I read in 2025 that everyone should read. And I think honestly, it's the best memoir I've ever read. It's up there with In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado in just terms of pieces of nonfiction that will have staying power with me and will sit with me for a long time and sort of it sounds dramatic, but I think it objectively changed my perspective on the way I approach political issues and the way I sort of view my own autonomy and power over addressing some of these issues. So cannot recommend it enough. If you take one recommendation away from this video, please let it be You Will Not Kill Our Imagination. I don't really know how to start the conversation about my breakup because I feel like I have talked about it a lot. And obviously my page is always about books. It is in some ways, it talks about my life. And my journey on Bookstagram was interesting because I honestly would not have started bookish social media if it wasn't for my ex-partner. I think I was always interested in joining the conversation, but I always just felt like I didn't have anything unique or compelling to say. And I will have to give my ex-partner credit for sort of giving me permission and sort of giving me the kick in the pants that, perhaps it's a little bit silly. Perhaps I wasn't going to grow overnight, but if it was something I was interested in and I found was going to be a good creative outlet, I should pursue it. And I think in our breakup, I realized that I sort of felt stuck or stagnant with content because my journey on Bookstagram felt so intrinsically tied to that relationship. And perhaps, exploring other types of content, whether that's Substack, whether that's TikTok, whether that's YouTube, is a bit of a response to that because I want to feel like I have sort of started something on my own without that person's influence. But it's just been a difficult time to navigate. So I talked about it quite a bit on Substack, and I won't go through all of my dirty laundry in my first video on YouTube, but it was quite a traumatic breakup in that I was with this person for over 3 years. There was no fighting. There was no sort of lead up to this breakup. I was essentially, discarded via text message after 3 years, and we haven't had a conversation since. So there was no sense of closure. There was no sense of a conversation around what didn't work in this breakup. And then this person sort of took to social media and badmouthed me and sort of had a very revisionist view of the breakup. And that was really difficult for me to navigate. And then just through sort of sheer bad timing, I ended up getting stomach ulcers, probably in due part to the stress and anxiety of this situation. And then I also had the flu. So I spent quite literally 2.5 weeks of December, quite like down and out. I was bedridden. I missed Christmas. I missed New Year's Eve. I had nothing to really do but sit with my thoughts. And writing on Substack, despite it being some of my more vulnerable or posts that necessarily are not my most articulate, I am so proud of them. And I'm glad that I was able to be vulnerable during a time that was so difficult for me. It was also for better or for worse, which I keep saying, oh my gosh, if I say for better or for worse one more time, please just, revoke my privileges of using this microphone. But I think it was good to sort of share that vulnerability because I heard from a lot of people about similar situations of ambiguous loss and grief. And whether that was a breakup or whether that was a ghosting of a friend or sort of a relationship that we felt quite close to and had a big impact on us ending abruptly, I think that's always difficult to navigate. And, I'm only a month out and I don't want to approach this video with the idea of, I'm having the best time of my life and this is the best thing that ever happened to me and I spun it into gold, because I think that was a lot of the content I was consuming at first, where you're so deep in a depression and so deep in grief that you don't really see an after. Yet all of the content I was seeing was so far removed from the initial, breakup or traumatic event that, these people were like, oh, it'll get better. And I didn't really see that for myself. So I wanted to chronicle sort of a more authentic, timely view of my breakup. And I think I'm finally feeling like myself again. I would be lying if I said I'm not bitter, I'm not angry, I'm not hurt that someone displayed such sort of cruelty and sort of disregard for me, especially after spending 3 years with this person. But I think I'm using it as a catalyst to really work on myself, and sort of viewing it as a new opportunity to start fresh. And I'm turning 30 this year, which I have very mixed opinions about. I know 30 is not that old. A lot of you are going to see this video and say, wow, you're still just a little spring chicken. But it feels like a new chapter for me. And I know that that is arbitrary, but having this breakup sort of coincide with that, it sort of has me reflecting that life looks a little bit different than what I anticipated. And that is not necessarily good or bad. It's just the opportunity for me to sort of step into the driver's seat of my life. So, my goal this year is to sort of relocate to Toronto. And if you know me, that is where I often spent a lot of my time. But, where I live now, there's not a lot of, book community, book events, author events. And I feel sort of, one step removed from that. And I would really like to be closer to sort of a community I'm passionate about and have the opportunity to, sort of meet more people who have these sort of like-minded views. I think also I feel just sort of stuck being in the place I went to university. Like I've been here now for almost 10 years and it just feels like time to spread my wings. So I don't want to overhaul my life overnight and sort of step into a new chapter, sort of, in response to a breakup. But I just feel like this is the kick in the pants that I needed. So I don't know what that's going to look like, but I'm hoping that, I'll sort of chronicle this as, in some ways, almost like a video journal of my life over this year. And so I can look back at a time where I felt very destabilized by recent events. And I don't know if in a year now I'll necessarily feel better or my life will look, you know, better in every single way, but at least I'll have this sort of permanent record of how I was feeling. And I hope that if you're going through some sort of upheaval or breakup or recent split or whatever it is, that you can find some degree of community and solidarity, knowing that despite me being a complete internet stranger, we all sort of go through these times. And social media, again, this is not news to anyone, is sort of an echo chamber where people are only posting their successes. And even myself, I was guilty of that. And I think this is the first time I've sort of admitted, I won't say a failure because I don't think there's a lot of personal fault on my end, but sort of a unexpected change in my life that I historically, I think, would have avoided talking about, and I would have just kept the conversation about books. But I've made so many good friends on bookish social media, and I've developed such a sense of community that it's important for me on a personal level to lean into that, but also to sort of be, in whatever way, an opportunity for people to feel like they're not alone going through these things. So plenty of you have already reached out via DMs. Oh, wow, Frankie's in frame. And I know that this is sort of a tricky time for a lot of people as we sort of come down from the holidays. It's a new year. There feels like a lot of pressure on ourselves to overhaul our life in every single way. And our lives are not necessarily, as choreographed as we like to think. And I know that's a silly statement to say that we are, sort of in the driver's seat of our own life. But one of my friends said that to me, and I realized how much freedom and flexibility I have as an adult, which I know is a privilege and not everyone has that. But the idea that I can just sort of move and relocate and sort of start a new chapter, I think is really empowering for me. And I'm not naive to think that that will solve all of my problems, but I am looking forward to it as sort of a new journey for myself. And the last thing I want to talk about is just sort of approaching content in 2026, which I already have touched on, but I think my goal this year is to really just focus less on the volume of content I'm producing and really just revert to content that I'm really passionate about. And obviously our passions sort of ebb and flow and they change. And for a while that was just sort of, carousel posts on Instagram, which I'll still create. But for whatever reason, I'm finding writing is a really good outlet for me at this time in my life. And I write a lot and I don't often publish that. And I feel like Substack has been a good opportunity for me to sort of practice my writing skills, but also be a little bit more vulnerable and be a little bit more of an open book, which historically I've struggled with. And I think I also want to start sharing my fiction. I would be lying if I told you, wow, I have a perfectly curated novel that's been sitting on my laptop for the last year. But I've written a couple pieces of short fiction as sort of a writing exercise for me to process emotions or recent events. And I think my goal, as sort of a 10-year goal, would be to start looking at creating more of my writing and looking into publishing that, whether that's like an informal short story collection or anthology or something like that. And so I think using Substack is a good place to start. And even creating video content. I don't know why I find yapping on the internet so cathartic, but it feels a little bit like permission because I've seen so many people who, have just stopped caring what people think. And I feel like that's so empowering because, people might think it's cringe or stupid that I'm just yapping on the internet, but for whatever reason, it brings me joy. And, perhaps in 5 years, I'll look back and think, wow, that was a real flop era of mine. But I just feel like if I'm in the Kia asylum of my life, I might as well lean into what brings me joy in this current moment. And if 5 people watch this video or 50 people watch this video, I think that's totally fine. I'm not approaching this from a place of trying to get famous or trying to bolster, some arbitrary social media following. I think it's going to be good for me to find, perhaps people this content resonates with and sort of just talk about books I'm passionate about because I love my friends, but a lot of them are not huge readers like myself. And so if I want to yap about a book for 5 minutes, this is sort of a safe space for me to do so. So sort of stay tuned for that. I have a couple sort of vlogs or themed TBRs that I want to tackle over this year. Admittedly, I started one that was looking at the lowest read books on my TBR. So I looked at Goodreads and found the sort of backlist titles that had been seldom read by people. And I read 2 so far. I had a list of 5. And I did not love them, to be honest. And I'm not saying because a book has a small amount of ratings, it's inherently bad or not worth reading. But in some of these cases, I can get why these are not commercially appealing to a wide audience. And so I'm going to try to finish that. And I don't really know what that video is going to look like, but it was a good exercise for me in sort of starting to think about content in a way that is complementary to my reading and that I'm not reading just to create content. And so it gave me the space to sort of talk about books and spend more time with the books that I'm reading and give them the attention they deserve. But also I think is good because it immortalizes my time with them and gives me something to look back on and sort of curate at the end of the year. I can figure out what is working in my reading life, what is not, and sort of start to hone in on, what I really enjoy as a reader. So last year, for example, I think I really found my passion for translated literature, which I know is not really a genre, but I think just exploring different cultures or different perspectives or way of telling stories has really resonated with me. And I think this year that sort of leads into my goal of wanting to read the full International Booker Prize long list. So that'll be 12 or 13 titles that releases next month. And I don't know if I'm going to love all the titles. I probably won't, but I think it's just a good challenge for myself to ensure that I'm constantly keeping my reading diverse and fresh and challenging myself to not just read whatever is popular or commercially appealing at that time. So I don't really have a ton of goals in my reading life for 2026, which I know is not the most compelling content, but I think I really just want to get back to basics this year and focus on reading the books that call to me in a given moment. And perhaps I'll like them, perhaps I won't. But at least it will ensure that my content feels very authentic to me and very unique to me. And I'm not just sort of joining the echo chamber of, I read the 5 most popular BookTok books and I had the same opinions as everyone else. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I get that we're all sort of trying to appease these arbitrary algorithms that sort of force us into those sort of niches. But I'm excited to sort of broaden my literary horizons and we'll see what that looks like. But yeah. Don't know how long this is going to be. I don't know what this is going to look like. I'm going to try to keep this as minimally edited as possible, but hopefully you found this a little bit helpful. And shameless plug, but I would appreciate your thoughts in the comments, good or bad. I'm always open to constructive criticism and knowing what content resonates with people. Not so much that I can change who I am on the internet, but just so I can sort of get a sense of where I'm sort of best suited in sort of talking about these books and the best medium to convey my thoughts. So stay tuned. I, again, don't know what this sort of YouTube chapter is going to look like for me, but definitely happy to be here. And I'm currently finding joy in it. So why not explore that further?